Holy Thursday, also known as Maundy Thursday, is one of the most solemn and meaningful moments in the entire Christian calendar. It is on this day that time seems to slow down in light of the grandeur of what is about to happen. It is the day immediately before the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, when the Master's last teachings, gestures, and words echo with a weight that transcends centuries. Within the liturgy of Holy Week, it is precisely on Holy Thursday that the Easter Triduum begins, a sacred period that includes the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, and which marks the peak of faith for Christians. The day is celebrated with almost silent reverence, as if one were aware that one is entering a land where the divine touched the earth with greater intensity. More than a historical remembrance, Holy Thursday is a spiritual experience, an invitation to participate not only with memory, but with the heart in what was Jesus' last encounter with his disciples before being betrayed. It was on this day that he celebrated the Last Supper, not as a common farewell, but as a moment full of mystery and symbolism, where bread and wine ceased to be mere elements of the table and became living signs of a new covenant between God and humanity. Christian tradition recalls that on that night, Jesus instituted the Eucharist, one of the central sacraments of faith, and gave new meaning to the commandment of love. What had previously been merely the fulfillment of the Jewish Passover now became the birth of a new Passover, in which Christ himself would offer himself as a sacrificed lamb. Holy Thursday is, therefore, the moment when the divine kneels before men. The Master becomes a servant, and the kingdom of God reveals itself in a paradoxical way through humility, sacrifice, and voluntary surrender. It is the day when human history changed forever, when the sky began to lean towards Calvary, and each gesture of Jesus began to carry the weight of redemption. The setting chosen by Jesus to celebrate his last meal with his disciples was not a random place. The Cenacle, a large room on the upper floor of a house in Jerusalem, became the stage for one of the most sacred and defining moments in all of Christian history. It was the time of the Jewish Passover, and thousands of pilgrims filled the city, coming from all over to remember the great deliverance that God had accomplished in Egypt. Tradition ordered that families eat the Passover lamb together, remembering the night when the angel of death passed over the houses marked with blood. But that year, something much more profound would be celebrated. Passover would never be the same again. Jesus sent 2 of his disciples to prepare everything: the room, the lamb, the wine, the bread, and the elements of the ritual meal. But he knew that this simple space to human eyes would be the place where he would begin a new and eternal covenant. The Cenacle was transformed into an altar. The silent walls bore witness to words that would span generations and gestures that would be repeated over the centuries by millions of people in every corner of the world. This was not just a meal, but an encounter between the divine and the human, between love and pain, between heaven and earth. The carefully prepared place revealed the Master's intention to be in intimate communion with his people before the approaching storm. There was something solemn in the air. The disciples, even without understanding the fullness of what was happening, felt the spiritual weight of that moment. The table became a symbol of sharing, unity, and farewell. Each gesture of Jesus, from the breaking of the bread to the offering of the cup, was charged with purpose, as if he were spiritually designing what would soon happen on Calvary. The upper room also became the place of the final teaching, where the Master looked into the eyes of his people and poured out his last instructions. There were no more crowds, just an intimate conversation, a kind of spiritual testament. And, at the same time, it was the beginning of the mission of the Church. That is why the Cenacle is remembered not only as the site of the Last Supper, but also as the birthplace of Christianity, the starting point of faith lived in community. It is in this sacred space that everything begins to take shape. The cross approaches, the betrayal is already underway, but in that hidden room in Jerusalem, Jesus plants the seed of eternity. And what could have been a simple meal among friends becomes, through his words and gestures, the supper that redefines the destiny of humanity. The supper began like so many others that celebrated Easter, but it quickly took on a completely new meaning. Sitting at the table with the 12, Jesus takes the bread in his hands, and with a gaze that spans time, pronounces words that would never be forgotten. "This is my body, which is given by you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he raises the cup and says, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is poured out for you." At that moment, Jesus transforms the simplest elements into eternal symbols of his surrender and unconditional love. The Last Supper ceases to be just a meal and becomes the institution of the Eucharist, the sacrament that unites the faithful to Christ in a profound and spiritual way. This gesture was not a simple ritual. It was the fulfillment of a promise, the announcement of a new covenant sealed not with the blood of lambs, but with the very blood of the Son of God. That broken bread represented the body that in a few hours would be crushed for the sins of humanity. That spilled wine pointed to the blood that would flow on the cross as a definitive offering of redemption. The Last Supper, therefore, is the pinnacle of communion between heaven and earth, where Christ offers in advance as food for the soul and a source of salvation. As they shared that moment, the disciples still did not fully understand what was before them, but Jesus knew. He knew that this was his last meal before his pain. He knew that one of his own would betray him. He knew that the weight of the world's sin would fall on his shoulders. Even so, there he was, teaching, serving, loving, until the end. The Last Supper was, in fact, the solemn rehearsal of the cross, where every word and every gesture announced the sacrifice that would soon follow. More than a farewell, that dinner was a summons. With the bread and wine, Jesus was giving his disciples a mission: to live in memory of him, to love as he loved, to serve as he served, and to never forget the price of freedom. The table of the Last Supper thus becomes the place where the Church is born, with a vocation to depart, to bless, and to give itself as well. In the intimacy of that supper, Jesus not only taught doctrine, he showed that true love is action, surrender, and sacrifice. And this love, embodied in the broken bread and shared wine, continues to be the center of the Christian faith to this day. In the Eucharist, the cross is present and hope is renewed. Because that night heaven sat at the table with men and nothing would ever be the same again. While the disciples were still digesting the weight of Jesus' words, an unexpected gesture scandalized the proudest hearts and moved the humblest. Without warning, the Master got up from the table, took off his cloak, took a towel, and tied it around his waist like a servant. In silence, he knelt before each of his friends and began to wash their feet. Something unthinkable in that culture. It was a task destined for slaves, not for the host, and much less for the Son of God. Yet there he was, washing the dusty feet of those who would abandon him in a few hours, including Judas himself. Peter's reaction was immediate. Shocked, he tried to stop him. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered firmly but tenderly, What I am doing you do not know now, but you will understand later." Peter insisted, "You will never wash my feet." And then he heard the sentence that silenced his resistance. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." At that moment, Peter surrendered, and Jesus, with the hands of a king and the heart of a servant, continued to wash their feet, one by one, without exception, without hesitation, without discrimination. This gesture was not just symbolic. It summarized the entire mission of Christ. The Word made flesh did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. By washing the feet of his disciples, Jesus redefines the concept of authority. He teaches that, in the kingdom of God, greatness is not on the throne, but on the towel. The true leader is the one who kneels. True love is the one who bows. More than an example of humility, the washing of feet is a radical call to authentic discipleship. "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." The teaching was given, not only in words, but in action. The Christian who wishes to follow Jesus must be willing to touch the dust of others with his own hands, to serve even when he is not recognized, and to love even those who will one day betray him. There, kneeling before sinners, Jesus revealed the essence of the gospel. Love that gives itself, a glory that is hidden in simplicity, a God who is not ashamed to humble himself. And when he got up, having finished serving, he returned to the table as if to say, "Now we are ready to face the world." The washing of the feet was the silent preparation for the cross, because only those who love with this kind of love are capable of giving themselves to the end. In the shadows of that upper room, between the breaking of the bread and the silence of the souls, Jesus revealed one of the most painful truths of that time. Among those at the table, there was a traitor. He did not shout, he did not point his finger, he did not expose himself violently. He said calmly, but with an almost unbearable weight, "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." Those words fell like thunder over the intimate atmosphere. The disciples looked at each other in confusion, anguish, and one by one asked, "Lord, is it I?" The doubt was not only about who would betray, but about how far each one would be capable of going when the dark hour arrived. Judas Iscariot, who had already conspired with the priests, was also there, sitting at the table with the one who had washed his feet moments before. He had the bread of communion in his hands, and in his heart the plan of betrayal. Jesus, with a look that goes beyond the surface, offers him a wet morsel and says, "What you have to do, do quickly." And Judas leaves. The night falls heavier, not only on the outside, but inside the soul. The presence of Judas in this narrative is not an annoying detail. It is a living warning. It shows that it is possible to be close to Jesus, to hear his words, to see his miracles, to participate in communion, and still keep one's heart distant. The betrayal did not begin with the kiss, but at the moment when Judas allowed ambition to speak louder than faith. And yet, Jesus did not exclude him. He washed his feet, gave him a place at the table, offered him the chance to turn back until the last moment. This is the love that persists even when rejected. The figure of Judas confronts us with the complexity of the human soul. He is proof that God respects even those who deny him, that the freedom we receive from the Creator is so profound that it can be used to crucify God himself. But it is also a reminder of the kind of surrender Jesus made, a surrender that does not depend on reciprocity, that does not calculate return, that loves to the end, even knowing the betrayal. This part of the night reveals that the drama of the cross had already begun there. The seed of pain was planted at the communion table itself, and Jesus' silence in the face of the announced betrayal is the most painful demonstration of a love that does not defend itself, only offers itself. He did not run away, did not hide, did not prevent. He allowed himself to be betrayed, because his mission was not to escape the cross, but to cross it. With the shadow of betrayal hanging over the room and hearts tightening with tension, Jesus decides to do something even more extraordinary. He begins to speak profoundly, as if he were sewing the final fabric of his teaching. This would not be just a farewell supper, but a spiritual testament. It was time to pour out his last words to his disciples before the storm. And what he chose to say reveals what mattered most to him: love, unity, faith, and hope.